Hi, I'm Reed, this is Coraline Publishing, and welcome back to our series on Why Not Try? And today we're talking about Warhammer Fantasy. So in the 1980s, a bunch of young, punky, anti-authoritarian, working-class kids, they were living in Thatcher's Britain, and they were all big nerds. They like D&D, they like Call of Cthulhu, but they had a pretty different frame of reference for all of this nerd stuff than did the nice middle-class kids of Wisconsin. Because the British guys, they were into 80s metal, Judge Dredd, Hammer House of Horror. They were a few years younger than Gygax and all his mates. And in time, they created their own fantasy setting that became the Warhammer world. Now, let's be fair, Warhammer is basically just a Tolkien derivative designed for wargaming. But if it were just that, it would not be one of my great favorites. And Warhammer Fantasy is one of my great favorites. We've seen elves and dwarves and hobbits before. We've seen human empires before. We've seen desperate fights against orcs before. But the execution is what makes the Warhammer Fantasy world so interesting. Specifically, if you always wanted to try a historical setting for your fantasy gaming, this is a great historically influenced setting, but it's still fantastic, so you don't have to do a huge amount of research or world building. The Warhammer world moves the action away from England directly into Europe, so you're playing in what is now Germany, or maybe France, or Eastern Europe, and it's very much meant to evoke the 100 Years' War, which is a very, very turbulent period of European history. So you have lots of small nations that are bound into kingdoms, that are bound into empires, and you've got lots of political turmoil because these kingdoms do not always get on, these empires are not always united. And you know, moving away from that sort of English, Celtic default fantasy, something as simple as just moving across the English Channel really does spice up your game. A well-described German hamlet, or a French vineyard, or different kinds of fashions, different kinds of weapons, different kinds of names for people and for places, can really give you a strong setting identity. Now, most medieval fantasy is set around, say, 1300, so it's all castles and knights and all that sort of business. But Warhammer advances the timeline forward a little bit so that you're around 1600 and you're on the cusp of leaving the medieval time period. So you've still got knights, castles, bastions, wizards, priests, a strong church, all that sort of thing. But it's beginning to change. You've got an emerging professional class of scientists and alchemists and wizards. So you've also got flintlocks and cannons. So you can do a more early medieval kind of tricorn hat and swirling cape kind of character. And you can have knights with guns, which happened historically, as well as mixing in Vikings and the rise of a professional class. So you get guilds and unions, and you get a different kind of crime. And honestly, just slightly moving the dial forward completely changes what a fantasy game looks like. And you know, while I love fantasy, I also really love stuff like, let's rob a bank, let's work for a bank, let's steal some guns. I think that simple addition of basic technology really refreshes and changes the landscape. And that's a lot of what I say about Warhammer. Even though it's a 30-year-old setting, 40-year-old setting, it still feels new and exciting compared to traditional D&D style settings. There's also a certain kind of grim humour to Warhammer that's often overlooked, and it's often just pushing Tolkien tropes to the limits. So goblins aren't just weird raiders or horrible muppets, they're weird little giggling, laughing bastards, and they're addicted to hallucinogenic mushrooms, and they're just horrible. And dwarves aren't just grumpy blacksmiths going like, I hate your bloody hair. That's not a dwarven accent. I hate your haircut, elf. Dwarves are psychotically proud, and they're about as emotionally resilient as an egg in a machine press, and they are murderously invented. They're not just gifted blacksmiths, they're gun-mad mentals. Elves are not just an ancient race of beautiful hippies, they're split into two sub-races. One is arrogant, immortal colonists and imperialists, and the next is a terrifying group of Celtic forest cannibals. And the best baddies in fantasy, the Skaven, are quite horrible, high-technology, demon-worshipping rat people, and they're really quite charming. Now, this is part of the punk ethos I was talking about that underlines Warhammer. There is a certain playfulness and a certain lack of respect to the source material. This is a world that doesn't take it too seriously, but at the same time can be completely black, because there's also chaos. Chaos is the big bad of the setting. Now, Warhammer has a lot of threats. There's political instability, so the big nations are always fighting amongst each other. There's half a dozen Dracula warlords. There is an Egyptian superlich who rules. The best dark elves in all of fantasy. I love you, Malice. You are the best. But chaos is the enemy of the enemies too. In the North Pole, there is a big rip into hell. That is the realm of chaos. So chaos is both a Lovecraftian horror of entities that want into our world from another dimension, but it is also a moral force of antinomian or satanic corruption. Chaos is both Cthulhu and the devil. So you've got not only a nation of Darth Vader Viking mutants who are all terrible and mean and all have a headache and who routinely run down from the north to smash the world in the face with their tentacle eyes. And that's fine. That's good. That's fun. But chaos isn't just a Frazetta painting. Out on the edges of the empire, cults to chaos thrive. Cults to the murder god. Cults to the god of pleasures. Souls sold to the god of disease. Bodies sold to the god of change. There is an ancient folk horror vibe out there that on the edges of town, chaos preys, and within the cities, the rich and the powerful are tempted by unspeakable pleasures. Children are left out in the woods for the beast men to take. The ancient runestones of the elves that dot the land are corrupted and turning dark. There is a constant moral threat. Which brings me to, I think, one of the most interesting things about all of the Warhammer setting is that it's not interested in heroism. Now, sometimes people describe Warhammer as very dark, but I don't think so. I think it's just that it's more interested in psychology. There's no heroic kings, there's just kings. And kings are the heads of political systems that drive people under. The people are poor and desperate, like in history, and like in history they have few legal rights. This isn't a world that rewards great Helm's Deep speeches. It's a world that is worried about paying the rent, and then surviving the Orc Horde, and then the local duke who really doesn't want to come into the sun and is asking a lot of questions about your daughter's neck hygiene. That's the world of Warhammer. These are just regular people trying to get by in a world of super demons and ancient liches. And this is a setting that means that you have to think about how to be a hero if you want to be a hero at all. And part of that careful retreat from necessarily being heroic gives Warhammer a reputation of being not so much a bold adventurer kind of game, but about being dirt poor and scummy and broke, and you're all rat catchers and gong farmers and you're the drunk bakers from Viz and you've got to fight the devil. Now, I'll tell you the truth, I love those sorts of games. I love it when you're just scumbags, desperate for a few guilders in your pocket and for a flea treatment because all you've got is scabs and a cough. So you raid a tomb, and because it's so horrible, you spend all the money on wine to block out the memories of raiding the tomb. But that is honestly a legacy of the system, because with the exception of the gimmicky 3rd edition, Warhammer has often been a percentile system. It's a bit old, a bit long on the tooth now, and the emphasis is that the combat is terrifying. Critical hit tables are hilariously violent. Do not get hit. If you're going to use the Warhammer system, do not fight. Run away. However, I've used Pendragon, I've used the rules only Flame Princess OSR, and I've used Fate Core to play up with the higher fantasy elements within Warhammer. You can be a fire mage, you can be a famous knight, or you can really engage with the folk horror elements and play witch hunters and priests and all the rest of it. I do like a great big high fantasy game. I do like a throwdown with a Chaos Lord or a Dracula King. So don't think that just because you've heard that Warhammer is all about coughing and, oh, look, I found a turnip, I won the game. It's not just that. You can really get a high fantasy experience out of it. But likewise, do not shy away from being a bunch of poxy student radicals or cheesemakers who discovered something terrible in the sewers and the local burgomaster hates you because you're poxy poor people, or you're just local farmers or hunters or poachers and you find out there's a weird cult living in the woods, and if you don't take care of it, well, the Inquisition will come, and they like to set fire to people before they like to do their proper investigations. So you can have the classical experience of fantasy gaming, of going on adventures, finding treasures, changing the fates of nations, but you can do that in any game. So do think about having one of these desperate, poor, coughing sort of Warhammer settings. Now, I would highly recommend that if any of this is interesting you, grab a copy of The Enemy Within, which is one of the really, really great adventures of the entire history of TTRPG. It was an adventure path before there were adventure paths, so ignore the grognards who tell you that adventure paths are new school nonsense. And honestly, if you think that Against the Giants or whatever is a classic adventure, no. That's like reading a Superman comic where he saves a cat, and then you read a Judge Dredd comic when he guns down a mutant Santa Claus with a window in his brain so you can see his brain all sloshing around. Enemy Within is fantastic, it's dark, it's interesting, and you just take a job, keeping a road safe, and you end up saving the Empire from a monstrous conspiracy. So that's Warhammer. It's dark, it's irreverent, it's anti-authoritarian, it's kind of funny, but at the same time is that there really is a strong horror element, and it's very adaptable. So if you were looking for something that's a lot more swaggering, that's a lot more subversive, and that's a lot more criminal in nature than traditional D&D, there's Warhammer. Please give us a like, please give us a share, tell all your friends. I'm Reed, this is Crowland. We'll see you soon.